Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a shift few predicted but many are now witnessing. The war that began beyond Russia's borders is turning inwards. We're talking about how cities across Russia once considered safe from direct conflict are now facing the shockwaves of a conflict traditionally fought elsewhere, and how the leadership under Vladimir Putin is responding by tightening control over the internet, the flow of information, and the public's perception of events at home. To begin, let's rewind a bit and frame our context. For decades, Russia has engaged in regional conflicts, proxy wars, and military operations abroad. The war in Ukraine, launched in earnest with Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, was viewed abroad as an outward campaign. Russian forces advancing, Ukrainian resistance, Western sanctions, diplomatic maneuvers. But recently, we're seeing something different. Scrutiny is turning inward. The physical and ideological consequences of the war are being felt within Russia itself, in its cities, through disruptions, strikes, outages, and in the regime's security apparatus responding to this home front dimension. One of the first dramatic signs of this turn came with reports of drone strikes and explosions deep inside Russian territory. For example, an industrial plant in the city of Stерлitamak, over 300 km from the Ukraine border, reported damage to its water treatment facility after what appeared to be unmanned aerial vehicle strikes. Similarly, the capital region, including Moscow itself, has been subjected to drone incursions, including the event on 30 May 2023 when Moscow was attacked by at least 8 drones, 5 of which were intercepted. These developments represent a stark escalation. The war is no longer just about Ukraine. Now, pieces of Russia's infrastructure and its urban hinterland are exposed. When cities appear vulnerable, the leadership responds. Reports indicate that the Kremlin has taken measures to limit or shut down internet access regionally, particularly following drone attacks or when disruption of services might spark broader unrest or demoralization. One YouTube video summarizes this phenomenon under the title, "Russian Cities Implode as Putin Shuts Down Internet," which signals the concern reaching popular media. What does it mean when the government starts turning the internet off in parts of its own territory? It means the home front is being treated as if it's a wartime zone. The information environment becomes part of the battlefield. Let's look more closely at how this plays out in 3 interlocking dimensions. 1. Physical attacks and disruption inside Russia. 2. Internet, communications and control measures by the government. And 3. Political and societal implications. 1. Physical attacks and disruption. The traditional expectation in many conflicts is that the home base is relatively secure. For Russia, the front lines were in Ukraine. Moscow and other Russian cities were thought to be insulated. That assumption is eroding rapidly. The incident in Stерлitamak is emblematic. What was once considered safe territory is now vulnerable. The article states, "These audacious strikes have unnerved the Russian populace." The psychological impact is twofold. 1. That the war has a reach far beyond the front lines, and 2. That Russian citizens previously sheltered from direct attack now may feel the war zone creeping closer. The drone attack on Moscow in May 2023 is also significant. Russia blamed Ukraine. Ukraine did not officially claim credit. Regardless, the fact remains that Moscow's air defense systems had to act, and the city's residents had to reckon with a threat they may have thought distant. For the Kremlin, this introduces a new calculus. Domestic security cannot be taken for granted. 2. Internet, communications, and control measures. When the regime perceives a risk of panic, unrest, or uncontrolled information, it moves to tighten control. The references above to shutting down internet, to stop Russians from finding out how, underscore the importance of information flow in this internal turn. If the population begins to believe that the government cannot protect its cities, that morale drops considerably. The leadership's ability to maintain the war effort militarily, economically, and politically depends in part on maintaining cohesion, belief in competence, and an image of control. Moreover, internet outages do more than simply cut off services. They signal to citizens a crisis state. They hamper communication, planning, coordination of local responses to damage, and independent reporting of events. In modern warfare, where information is as much a weapon as artillery, controlling the narrative becomes vital. For the Russian leadership, the shift inward means the narrative is more fragile than previously thought. Three political and societal implications. Let's step back and consider what this all means for Russian society and the regime's internal dynamics. When a state launches a war, especially one of magnitude like Russia's in Ukraine, it expects a home front that supports or at least accepts the distraction. But when the home front begins to experience the war's impact directly, through attacks, shortages, service disruptions, the assumptions shift. Citizens may begin to ask, why are we paying this cost? Is the leadership protecting us? Can I trust the assurances? This shift has implications for morale, for economic stability, for internal dissent or passive resistance. If internet access is restricted, people may turn to alternative communication channels, or rumors may spread. The regime may respond with increased surveillance, harsher controls, or accelerated repression of dissent. In fact, separate reporting shows that the Russian regime has increasingly targeted its own pro-war voices. Once loyal supporters turned objects of suspicion, indicating internal fractures. The irony is stark. A regime that once encouraged patriotic fervor is now squeezing down even the voices that once amplified its message. For citizens, the everyday impacts might include longer power outages, reduced service availability, increased anxiety over strikes in places once considered safe, and a creeping sense of being part of the war apparatus rather than being protected from it. Economically, damage to industrial plants, the need for expanded air defenses, and the cost of communications shutdowns all impose burdens. Politically, the leadership must reassure the public, maintain legitimacy, and prevent panic or collapse of social cohesion, all while allocating significant resources to the war effort abroad. Now let's explore some of the deeper structural drivers of this inward turn. Firstly, as Ukraine and its international backers have adapted, Ukraine has increasingly carried the fight into Russia's logistics, industrial rear, and infrastructure nodes. The traditional model for Russia's war in Ukraine depended on rear logistics and production capacity inside Russian territory. When that capacity becomes vulnerable, the war calculus shifts. Analysts note this by highlighting how these strikes have snarled Russia's war machine. While not referencing a specific article in our set, the trend is clear. In response, Russia may bolster air defenses, military production in more secure zones, and ramp up internal security. But those measures cost time and resources. Secondly, the war's duration and the cost burden have increased domestic strain. Sanctions, inflation, mobilization, and operational losses weigh on Russia. When citizens begin to feel the war's effects in their daily lives, not just as economic abstract, but as direct risk of explosion, power loss, or disrupted internet, the social contract is under pressure. We're seeing a war not only fought abroad, but experienced at home. Thirdly, the leadership's propaganda and information strategy must evolve. In the early phases of the war, narrative control focused on Russian heroism abroad, necessary special operation rhetoric, and appealing to patriotic sentiment. But when attacks happen inside Russia, that framing can falter. Questions arise of whether homeland is safe, whether the state's defenses are effective, whether the war might drag on indefinitely. So tactics shift, more emphasis on thanks to our soldiers, we repel aggression, we are unified, and less on victory is near, if reality suggests it is not. The internet shutdowns and communications control are part of that strategy to limit exposure to unfiltered reality. Another dimension, the internal power dynamics within Russia. When domestic shocks escalate, the relationship between the regime's military, security apparatus, the media, and the citizens is tested. The leadership must manage all three. If internal criticism surfaces, whether from military bloggers, pro-war commentators, or local officials losing faith, the regime may respond with designations such as foreign agent or terrorist to bring them into line. The turn inward thus includes political purges and internal suppression, not just battlefield counters. Let me highlight a few concrete implications for how this might evolve and what to watch. 1. Increasing decentralization of strikes. If Ukraine continues to strike industrial or logistical targets deeper inside Russia, then more regions may face disruptions. That doesn't only mean missile or drone hits. It means potential railway disruptions, energy supply interruptions, telecom disruptions. Each one raises the stakes for Russia's internal security. 2. Escalation of state controls. We may see more frequent or broader internet shutdowns, mobile service disruptions, or regional states of emergency. Enhanced censorship, intensified monitoring of social media, and legal actions against dissenters might become more common. The government's imperative will be to keep internal support stable even as the home front becomes less safe. 3. Potential for social unrest or at least erosion of public confidence. Historically, when states fight protracted wars and the costs become visible domestically, popular support can weaken. In authoritarian contexts, the mechanisms of dissent may be more restricted but passive forms, such as apathy, migration, avoidance of mobilization, can increase. The Russian population may begin to feel that the war's costs outweigh the declared benefits. 4. International perception and leverage. For Russia's adversaries and observers, the inward turn is both a vulnerability and a propaganda moment, demonstrating that Russia's cities and infrastructure are under threat, can change strategic calculations. It may force Russia to divert resources from the front lines to the rear, weaken its offensive capacity, or increase the urgency of negotiating or de-escalation. For Ukraine, showing penetration into Russian territory has symbolic power. It says the war is not just on Ukrainian soil. 5th, the long-term risk of institutional strain. Russia's military, intelligence, and industrial systems have been under pressure. Casualties, material losses, sanctions, and domestic controls all add up. Having to also defend deeper internal territory, protect infrastructure, and maintain domestic stability means the state must absorb greater burdens. Over time, that could lead to inefficiencies, resource drain, or policy missteps. From a narrative perspective, we might summarize the war turning inward as follows: the front line has broadened, the rear defensive line is now Russia's internal territory, the war is no longer just abroad but also at home, the regime's control mechanisms, communication, narrative, repression, are activated to mitigate domestic consequences, the entire population is more directly exposed to the war's costs and risks. What does this mean for viewers, analysts, and citizens? If you're watching this from outside Russia or from within, consider the following takeaways. Keep an eye on reports of outages, communications shutdowns, or region-specific internet blackouts inside Russia. They may signal incoming attacks or state responses to them. Monitor the industrial and logistics nodes inside Russia. Disruptions there often hint at strategic shifts rather than isolated incidents. Be aware that the information coming out of Russia may be heavily filtered. The domestic narrative is likely being managed tightly, especially in affected zones. Recognize that the war's trajectory might change if Russia begins to shift resources toward internal defense rather than exclusively offensive operations abroad. This could open opportunities for Ukraine or change the war's dynamics. Appreciate that the home front dimension of any war is often underreported. When cities previously deemed safe become contested zones, the political, economic, and social costs multiply. Of course, there are countervailing factors. Russia still retains significant territory, resources, nuclear capacity, and a large population. The leadership has shown willingness to adapt, repress dissent, and control narrative. Moreover, the Russian armed forces, while challenged, have not collapsed, and the war effort continues. So the inward turn represents stress, but not necessarily imminent collapse. Nevertheless, it changes the risk equation. Let's also consider the human dimension. Imagine living in a city like Moscow or other Russian regional centers, used to everyday life, believing the war was somewhere else. Suddenly you hear about drone strikes, industrial accidents of suspected origin, internet or communication disruptions in your region. That kind of shock reverberates deeply. It may not immediately translate into open protest or mass unrest, especially under a strong security state, but it affects trust, sense of safety, and the willingness of people to make sacrifices. Soldiers may reconsider their chances of returning home safely. Families may worry about being targets of wider retaliation. Businesses may factor disruption into investment. All these ripple effects reduce the cushion behind which a regime fights a war. Another dimension to reflect on: the psychological impact on the regime and military. When the war that was expected to be fought abroad starts to impose costs at home, the calculation changes. Leadership may become more cautious, internal critics may gain traction, scapegoating may increase, and the fear of political destabilization grows. Indeed, some recent reports show pro-war voices inside Russia falling out of favor. In a sense, the war inward is a double-edged sword. It threatens both the populace and the regime's cohesion. Now, what are the potential future scenarios? Let me outline three broad possibilities. Scenario: a escalation of internal conflict and deeper home front warfare. In this case, more Russian cities and infrastructure come under direct threat. More frequent outages, strikes, or attacks inside Russian territory force the regime to respond aggressively. Russia may ramp up internal air defense, launch retaliatory strikes into Ukraine, and tighten domestic controls significantly. The war becomes more of a full-scale national war for Russia, not just an external campaign, but a defensive war for the homeland. The costs escalate, public morale erodes, and the economic burden increases. Scenario B: stabilization with deferred internal pressure. Here, Russia manages to resecure its internal rear, whether through better air defense, dispersal of key infrastructure, or improved communication controls, such that large-scale internal disruptions become fewer. The home front remains under strain but is manageable. The war continues abroad, but with reduced internal shock. In this case, the inward turn is significant but stopped before systemic collapse. The internal narrative is maintained, and the public stays largely supportive or apathetic. The war becomes protracted, with resources stretched but internal collapse avoided. Scenario C: internal strain leads to domestic political shift. In this scenario, the internal pressures accumulate: economic decline, repeated disruptions, growing private skepticism, losses abroad. The regime's legitimacy erodes, internal dissent becomes more visible, and cracks in the security apparatus widen. Under such conditions, a regime change of sorts not necessarily immediate could become more likely. At a minimum, there could be shifts in how the war is managed, who holds power, and what the public expects. The war may pivot from being external and expansionist to being more about containment and domestic survival. the inward turn becomes a catalyst for transformation. Which scenario unfolds likely depends on several factors: Ukraine's capacity to strike deeper inside Russia, Russia's ability to defend and adapt, the economic burden of war and sanctions, domestic resilience of the Russian populace and institutions, and how international actors respond. For watchers of global security, all of these matter. Importantly, this shift also has implications beyond Russia. If Russian cities are vulnerable, it changes Western calculations about supporting Ukraine, about Russia's offensive capacity, about how resilient Russia really is. It may encourage more aggressive support for Ukraine, or at least adjustments in strategy. Similarly, it may affect how other countries view conflict dynamics, protecting the home front, securing cyberspace and communications, understanding that wars far from one's own border can reach inside. Let me close with a reflection on what to watch in coming months. Reports of internet or mobile communication outages in Russian regions, especially following unexplained industrial accidents or drone strikes. Domestic Russian media narratives shifting from "we are winning" to "we face threats at home," or "we must hold together under new conditions." Internal Russian government actions, designation of individuals as foreign agents or extremists, intensification of surveillance, arrests of pro-war bloggers or regional officials, economic signals, industrial disruptions, logistic bottlenecks, reallocation of resources from offensive operations to domestic defense. Social indicators, migration of skilled workers from Russian cities, increase in private security measures, public statements of dissatisfaction within permissible bounds, corresponding Ukrainian and Western signals. Are they targeting deeper infrastructure inside Russia? Is the strategy pivoting from defense to offense inside Russian territory? How is Russia reacting? In sum, the war that began in 2022 as an outward campaign into Ukraine is now showing a second front, inside Russia. Cities once considered safe are facing the consequences of a war whose ripple effects reach deep into the Russian state and society. The internet, the narrative, the social contract, the home front, all of these become battlegrounds. For the Russian leadership, this inward turn is both a new threat and a new test. For Ukraine and its allies, it might be a strategic opening. For civilians living in Russian cities, it signals that the war is no longer somewhere else. It might be right next door. Thank you for watching. If you found this deep dive helpful, like, share, and subscribe for more analysis. Let me know in the comments what aspect you'd like to explore next. The industrial logistics inside Russia, the communications control mechanisms, or the social impact on Russian cities. See you in the next video.